So a couple weeks ago, the second season of House of the Dragon, the prequel series to Game of Thrones, came to a close with a 90-minute finale. And, people are not very happy. Let's just put it like that. I think it would be fair to say that House of the Dragon Season 2 was kind of a strange season. To make an open-minded assessment, it was a bit of a mixed bag, and while I enjoyed most of it, I also think there is a lot about it that needs to be discussed because the show might be going in a direction that I don't entirely like. First of all, before anything else, I need to say this. While I am going to talk about the issues I had with the season, I do believe people have been a bit harsh on it. The bizarre explosion of backlash that sort of erupted after the finale aired was, in my opinion, a little unwarranted. There has been a serious lack of nuance with the discourse around this season, and everybody is angry and shouting. But let's set the record straight. Was Season 2 of House of the Dragon a bit of a letdown? Yes, it was. Does that mean the season was bad? No, I don't think it does. I think this is where the internet discourse cliche with no nuance awkwardly comes into play. A lot of people online have two modes. Whatever they just watch either has to be an untouchable masterpiece, or it's the worst piece of trash they've ever seen in their lives, actually. And there is rarely any space for any kind of middle ground. House of the Dragon Season 2 was kind of a letdown in some parts, so now people are saying, actually, this was worse than Season 8 of Game of Thrones. And like, most of the people saying that were also praising the season during its first act, but because the season finale disappointed, they're now retroactively hating the entire season? Like, bro, relax. Calm down. Have a Kit Kat, have a Capri Sun, everything's gonna be okay. A lot of people are also unhappy with the season being this short. Compared to Season 1's 10-episode run, Season 2 only had 8, and a lot of people are of the opinion that it simply is not enough. In a more general way, we seem to be in a period where audiences are starting to truly dislike the current model of short TV seasons, and not only because the seasons are bite-sized, but also because while seasons have gotten shorter, the wait in between seasons has only gotten longer. Like back in the old model of television that we were used to in the 90s and early 2000s, seasons would air as they were being shot. And since the seasons were so long and gave the production ample time to get ahead, we only had to wait 5 or 6 months for a new season of our favorite show. However, today, the model is very different. More and more TV shows take up to 2 years before coming out with new seasons, despite the fact that they only deliver about a third of the amount of episodes we used to get. I mean, hell, I just made a video about Stranger Things, and in it, I talk about how we got used to waiting 3 years in between seasons of that show. 3 years! That's only 2 seasons of TV, a total of like 16 episodes in 6 years, over half of a decade. And for audiences, that's incredibly frustrating, and I am including myself here. I don't believe every show is meant to have short seasons. Some shows excel at it and would actually be worse if they had to be longer, but some shows simply have no business being so condensed. And in the case of House of the Dragon, yeah, it's understandable. People were left incredibly disappointed with it, and that disappointment quickly turns into frustration when paired with the reality that Season 3 probably won't come out before 2026. I believe the showrunners recently said they don't plan to even start shooting Season 3 until early 2025. And that doesn't make sense to me. Game of Thrones managed to have a season out every year for the first 7 seasons. I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure almost every season of the show came out in April, meaning it would end its run in June or July, so you technically only had to wait like 9 months between seasons. So why do we suddenly have to wait 2 years for House of the Dragon? What changed? Anyways, you get it. The industry really needs to get its shit together, and people were annoyed that Season 2 was only 8 episodes long, which is even more noticeable because, as I said, the second half of the season is what a lot of people perceive as a letdown. And I share that feeling to some extent, because if we're talking story-wise, I think one of my biggest pieces of criticism when it comes to House of the Dragon 2 is simply that the season feels incomplete. Like, despite the fact that the finale is basically a movie that's an hour and a half long, by the time the credits started rolling, I didn't feel like I had watched a complete season of television. It still felt like there should be another episode after this. It felt cut short. We spent the whole season watching the setup, but with no sense of payoff. The season 1 finale very distinctly ends an arc and starts another. It ends with an incident that is a point of no return. Aemon kills Rhaenyra's son, and that is the ultimate transgression. Essentially, the season ends by telling you, yep, the time for diplomacy is over. Every scenario to move forward with peace has been wiped out. This war is now inevitable. Season 2 doesn't really have that sense of finality. It doesn't feel like this season ends an arc. It very much still feels like we're in the middle of one. And again, I feel conflicted because I see a lot of people online saying that the finale sucks and it's a nothing burger that has no point, and I disagree with that. Like, a lot. The problem with the finale is not that it's bad. It's actually a really good episode of the show that does a lot of work narratively. It's a good episode. But it's not a good finale. And it's not a good finale because it doesn't really have a sense of payoff. I'm all for the show having the characters mostly put their pieces on the chessboard. It's a show about politics. It makes sense. But we essentially watch them doing that all season, only to not have the actual game of chess begin. So it's a lot of rising tension that doesn't have a release. Anyways, I don't know if any of that makes sense or if I sound a little messy, but I think the more we're going to be talking about it, the more it'll be understood. There is a lot to say about this season, and yes, there are definitely some narrative choices that display themselves as pretty significant red flags for the future of the show that I believe need to be addressed, so we'll get into it. But first, Skillshare. Okay, so I've been working on a very secret project for over a year now. I still can't tell you what it is, even though I'm dying to, but what I can tell you is that for this secret project, I've been studying 3D modeling, and in my extensive research, I landed on this Skillshare class by Derek Elliott that teaches you how to take your first steps on Blender, and it has been a colossal help. And that, right there, is the magic of Skillshare. Skillshare is a gigantic online community where you can learn about pretty much any topic you can think of. I like to describe it as an infinite pool of knowledge, and it has thousands of classes for curious and creative people to explore. From filmmaking to web design, photography, illustration, creative writing, whatever it is, my guy, Skillshare has it all. Any type of curiosity you want to expand on or whatever goal you want to achieve, there's literally nothing Skillshare cannot help you learn. It's the ultimate information tool. And boy, oh boy, you guys are in luck. Because the first 500 people to use the link in the description will be able to get a month free trial of Skillshare. You can go and explore the platform and learn about anything you would like for an entire month for free. Anything you want, the whole thing will be at your disposal. So this is your chance to go and explore any topic you're curious about. So check out the link in my description, join Skillshare, and start learning. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to our dragons. Alright, so quick recap. Last season, King Viserys Targaryen named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir. And a lot of people were not cool with that because she's a woman, and they're not down with having a woman on the throne. So the king's hand, Otto Hightower, and other members of the council secretly conspired to wait for the king to die from his illness to swiftly take the throne by crowning one of his sons behind Rhaenyra's back. Rhaenyra knows many people in power are against her succession, so she tries to prepare, but she gets bested at the last moment, and her little brother Aegon is crowned king in front of the common folk, confirming him as the heir to the Iron Throne. So Rhaenyra sends her sons to convince other powerful families to join her cause to retake the throne as the rightful queen of Westeros, the queen chosen by the king. But as we know, Aemon beats them there, and he kills Jace by accident, sending Rhaenyra into a fury as the Greens officially drew first blood. So now we're divided in two camps. The Greens, led from the shadows by Otto Hightower and his daughter Alicent, the ones who orchestrated the takeover, and the Blacks, led by Rhaenyra, who want to restore the kingdom envisioned by Viserys. This season is essentially picking up right where Season 1 left off. Rhaenyra is consumed by grief after losing her child. She has lost a lot of people in her life and has had to deal with a lot of grief, but she's never known grief like this. Losing a child is a level of pain she cannot bear. Daemon is angry, and he wants blood, while Alicent is horrified by what happened, and she is starting to be a little bit afraid of her sons, who now have too much power. One of the reasons why Season 2 feels so different from Season 1 is also probably due to the fact that Miguel Sapochnik, one of the two showrunners of Season 1, left the show very abruptly after Season 1 ended because of some unresolved conflicts with HBO. So basically, half of the vision of the show for Season 1 is no longer here, which probably explains why it feels so different now. And aside from that, there are some shifts in the season that are quite impossible to ignore. First of all, due to the story of Season 1, we don't get to have Paddy Considine's insane performance as King Viserys anymore, save for a couple of cameos later in the season. He was so good, man. I wish he was still around. Having 80% of the season taking place without Otto Hightower was definitely a choice. His absence is very noticeable, especially because, like a number of elements of this season, Otto's exit is very anticlimactic, and he brings so much gravitas to the show that when he leaves in episode 2, boy do you feel the lack of him. His final confrontation with Aegon is easily one of the best scenes of the show, and I found myself yearning for more of this type of dialogue.
And you acceded without consulting me or the council. Instead of judgment, you display impetuousness and diminish us in the eyes of our enemy.
Yeah, the dialogue in this season doesn't feel as strong as it was in the first season, and that's also noticeable. And that sort of sets the tone for the writing in a more broad vision. In general, I think one very honest truth about Season 2 is that it is undeniable that the show's writing has gotten way more shallow. Not that it doesn't have any depth, it still does, thank God, but there is something about the writing this season that feels less sophisticated than the previous season, and it is hard to ignore. Despite how the Targaryen civil war is kickstarted in the Season 1 finale, the events of this season come across as surprisingly trivial. Some criticize the season for being uneventful, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't feel like I finished this season and thought to myself, well, nothing fucking happened. No, a lot of shit happened, actually. I feel like calling the season uneventful is unfair. It was slow, I'll give you that, but slow and uneventful are not the same thing. I do agree, though, that a lot of plot points felt a little stupid in some places. I very quickly grew tired of the James Bond-ass missions of sneaking into places in disguise almost every episode. Everyone is sneaking into everyone's place. As long as you're wearing a hood, you're basically the faceless god and you can ninja yourself anywhere. Rhaenyra sneaks into King's Landing, Daemon too, Alicent sneaks into Dragonstone, Sir Eric sneaks in there too. Like, what are we doing, dude? But most of all, the conflict of the show has gotten very surface level, which leads me to what I think is ultimately the biggest problem with House of the Dragon Season 2, and it is simply that the show itself picks a side. This season makes it very clear that the writers have a biased approach to this conflict. They're telling you up front, the blacks are the good guys, the greens are the bad guys. There is no space for debate here, there is no ambiguity to be had, the writers are very partial about it. Black good, green evil. That's it. And I think that choice is very unfortunate. And the reason why it's such a problem to me is because it removes the story's greatest asset for the audience's relationship with the characters and the narrative. And that asset is perspective. And this element of perspective, of having the story be impartial and focusing on the ideas that cause the conflicts, is what gives the story its humanity. That's what makes the large scale of running the Seven Kingdoms have a grounded foundation. There is a reason why the intimacy of the conflict in Season 1 was specifically set between Rhaenyra and Alicent. They were the two opposite perspectives of the show. Rhaenyra is trying to honor her father's wishes. She wants wants the throne because that was the rightful line of succession chosen by the king. She never really aspired to be a queen, but she accepted her role in the order of things. But that was taken from her by Alicent, who believes, mistakenly, that Viserys' last words were a request for her to make Aegon king, something she cannot bring herself to deny. Alicent is a character who is entirely about virtue. Her entire life has been about following the rules in the name of honor, whether it be following societal norms, religious customs, or political responsibility. She is devoted to being devoted. Her sense of righteousness is everything she claims to stand for. And in Rhaenyra, she sees someone who fundamentally opposes those values, because she had to make all the sacrifices to get to where she is, whereas Rhaenyra was handed power on a silver platter and does her own thing without following the norms. She sees Rhaenyra as this spoiled child who takes her position for granted, and she resents her for being free-spirited and living her life outside of what is expected of her. So Rhaenyra wants the throne because it's literally her right, but Alicent wants to take it because she believes she is making things right, and Rhaenyra resents her for it because she believes Alicent is lying about her father's last words to usurp the throne, and she sees this as the ultimate betrayal, not of her, but of her father.
My father loved me, Alicent. And I believe he loved you, too. Did you betray him at the very last?
He changed his mind, Rhaenyra. He changed his mind.
This conflict is powerful because both of these women are convinced they are doing the morally correct thing, but their definitions of what is morally correct are fundamentally opposed. As an audience member, you can see the points being made in both of them. There is nuance to it, there is ambiguity. Both of them make good points that make you understand them, but they also make weird decisions that make you question their integrity. That's what made audiences choose sides during the first season, because the show was very impartial about its presentation of the conflict, and the people behind the show knew that and capitalized on it. The whole marketing campaign of season 2 is based around the insane amount of discourse between people rooting for the Greens or for the Blacks. They knew there was a strong divide about it, and they knew it was the key to building hype around the new season. The tagline of the season is "All must choose," which is intentionally perpetuating this idea that there are sides for the audience to pick. They even released a trailer themed for the Blacks and one for the Greens. But then, in season 2, the show is suddenly like, yeah, the discourse doesn't really matter, does it? The Blacks are the good guys. You should be on Rhaenyra's side. We're on her side, so you should be on her side too. And so, as a result, the perspective of the Greens is literally removed with Alicent's arc taking a left turn. More on that later, and the faction is now portrayed more like traditional villains, while Rhaenyra and the Blacks become more righteous figures fighting for good and justice. Again, the Game of Thrones universe is largely about politics. It's not about good guys and bad guys, it's about the clash of perspectives driven by an infinite number of reasons. Losing that elementary feature has never been good for this universe. The Game of Thrones series also started to go south when the writers started to draw a line between which characters are good and which ones aren't, and mostly when they started to dictate for the audience which ones are right and which ones are wrong. These stories simply do not work as well when the writers are telling you who you're supposed to be rooting for, and that's a big weakness of House of the Dragon Season 2, especially when it comes to the major opposition between Alicent and Rhaenyra. Again, Season 1 has the conflict very much centered around these two, and the marketing of Season 2 really hyped up the escalation of that. They're the ones facing each other on the main poster of the season, but I do feel like the show fails to fulfill that promise. Their conflict of ideals is sort of abandoned this season in favor of a way more hollow battle of good against evil, which in my opinion makes this story instantly less compelling.
You have wounded me.
weakened my claim to the throne, my ability to raise an army, my standing among my own council.
Alright, let's talk about the big gal. So, to get straight to the point, a lot of people have complained that Rhaenyra is rendered a very boring character this season. People found her very compelling in season 1, whether they liked her or not, and it was very easy to root for her for most people, but now it seems like a lot of people are just annoyed with where her story goes. And I gotta say, I agree a little bit. And the reason why I agree is mostly because of a larger issue that I have with the writing this season, an issue that I think can become a very big problem for the show if it persists. See, it seems like the writers have made a very conscious choice of absolving female characters in this show of any sort of wrongdoing. Let me explain what I mean. The show, again, takes a very biased approach to the conflicts at hand, and a sort of reoccurring theme with that bias this season is that it attempts to drive the message that women in Westeros are not responsible for any of the problems the kingdom has, and they are only victims of the men calling the shots. They're sort of reduced to this Hollywood-ized message of #feminism and are stripped of all their emotional and moral complexity and all of their agency so that we can portray them as victims of the patriarchy. So any sort of flaws, layers, or nuanced traits female characters in the show used to have are either erased or they become background attributes that are no longer acknowledged head-on. Women are now always shown to be the bigger person, the morally superior ones. They're lenient peacemakers who sigh and scoff at the men who battle while they pick up the pieces to fix everything and actually bring peace. And they don't want war, they just have to endure it because of the men. According to this season, women in Westeros never strive for power. They're too good to desire power and are too morally sound to ever be corrupted by it. Sure, okay, let's go with that. I understand the message behind it, like I get what they're getting at with it, but I think the show falters in presenting it by sacrificing the character's complexity. Westeros has always been a ruthless environment for women. We knew that, brother. Women in this world, even those born in wealth, do not get to have it easy. It is a fucking brutal environment to women, but I think portraying this idea by absolving female characters of their immoral actions, taking away their agency and any sort of liability, is disingenuous. And it makes the message feel cheap and thin, especially given what we know. A lot of women in Westeros have been corrupted, broken, and driven by power, by lust, or by vengeance. Vengeance is actually one of the biggest themes attached to female characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. Cersei Lannister had her own husband assassinated so that she could put her young son on the throne and get more power from the shadows. She unleashed wildfire on her own city for personal revenge, killing hundreds, if not thousands of innocent people with no remorse, which led to the suicide of her youngest child and her making herself queen in the process. Her endless selfishness is one of her character's biggest traits, and believe it or not, she's even worse in the books. Olenna Tyrell did horrible things to get her family on the throne, including assassinating a king. She hijacked her own sister's engagement to marry her rich and powerful lover and become heir to Highgarden and the Reach. And then, not only did she have Joffrey assassinated, she told Joffrey's daddy it was her right before dying and asked him to tell Cersei just to drive one last knife in her back purely out of spite. That is some gangster mafia-ass behavior. Marjorie Tyrell willingly seduced a 13-year-old boy to get to the throne. Catelyn Stark essentially started a war by unfairly imprisoning Tyrion Lannister. And if you don't know about the book lore around Catelyn Stark, I will kindly invite you to go and Google Lady Stoneheart and see what I mean when I talk about women in Westeros and revenge. Arya Stark's entire character is about revenge. Her unique life goal is to become a strong fighter so she can kill a bunch of powerful people with her own hands because she considers they led to the downfall of her family and the death of her father. Girl goes to sleep every night not by counting sheep, but by reciting the list of names of each person she's going to kill. Ilaria Sen kinda stole stole the throne from Doran Martell and made an ultimate power play to avenge Oberyn's death. She also murders an innocent teenage girl herself just to get even with the Lannisters. She has no political gain to have from it, she's just doing it out of revenge. We watch Rhaenyra Targaryen become so corrupted by power that she effectively became the very thing she swore to protect the world from. We watch her commit a genocide purely out of pride and then reveals to Jon that she fully intends to become a dictator.
What about everyone else? All the other people who think they know what's good.
They don't get to choose.
Women in Westeros have been repeatedly shown to be morally questionable. They're human, they have layers, they have contrasting aspects, and it was also the case in Season 1 of House of the Dragon, but now this has sort of been taken away from them. This season, the writers kind of sanctified Rhaenyra. They made her this ethically foolproof character that never does anything inherently wrong. They do not want Rhaenyra to ever appear to have any sort of complex morality. She is not allowed to ever do anything out of anger, out of spite, out of pride, out of selfish desires, out of a desire to seize power. And whenever horrible things happen, the show is very careful to place the blame onto people around Rhaenyra, but the responsibility never falls on her. She is suddenly so selfless and pure and driven by a desire for peace, despite the final shot of the last season announcing that any concept of peace was rendered inconceivable due to the unprovoked murder of her child. And it's the same with other female characters on the show. We watched Rhaenys kill dozens of innocent civilians when she crashed Aegon's coronation. She doesn't give a shit, and she could have done that at least to blast burn the Greens with her fucking Charizard, but she doesn't. She literally just killed a bunch of innocent people and then fucked off and let Alicent and her crew live. Alicent herself has a whole bunch of moral transgressions we will talk about in a few minutes, but this season she's also reduced to a sad sufferer who only ever wanted peace, which is an incredibly disingenuous portrayal of her character. Hell, she tries to sell this "let's be better than the men" message to Rhaenys in Season 1, and Rhaenys scoffs at her because she knows she's a fucking bullshitter. I'm not gonna say this is character assassination, because I do think the core of their characters is still there somewhere, but Rhaenyra and Alicent are the two main characters of the show, and they're rendered the two least interesting characters of the season because they're no longer allowed to be morally complex, due to the fact that now the writers want the female characters to be portrayed as one-dimensional, innocent do-gooders burdened with the violence of men. And okay, sure, message understood, but message compromised character integrity.
Anything interesting about these women is being undercut by the showrunners signaling consistently men are bad and violent, women are the gentle peacemakers, leaning a little too heavy for my taste into gender essentialism, which makes both of them very dull and boring. There's a shocking lack of trust in the audience. We know, and we've known since '96, that Westeros is not a friendly place to women. It's hostile to women, to cripples, to bastards, and the broken things, anybody on the fringes. She's not doing anything but reading books and being undermined by her council for the 5th time. We get it. Men bad, women good. And that's because, again, the showrunners are favoring the pseudo-feminism of showing Alicent and Rhaenyra being the victims of patriarchy, and completely sidelining any sort of character traits that they may actually develop through their actions. Trust the process, trust the process. I trusted the process, and I was so sure we're gonna see something post Meleys and Rhaenys dying. But we're just back to square one. Enough with the pseudo-feminism. We know that Westeros is not friendly towards women. We don't need to be told or shown that all the fucking time. Give them some character traits. Give them something to do. Have them make some bad decisions. Because I'm getting a little bored. Not gonna lie.
Rhaenyra is a character that is interesting because she's not that virtuous. She's not the most morally decent person. She's not the gentle saint this season tries to paint her as. She makes very questionable decisions in Season 1. She's not that honorable. She fakes her husband's death and fully lets her family believe he died in a freak accident. People loved her bond with Rhaenys in Season 2, but don't forget that Rhaenyra never told her that her son is really still still alive. She also has a number of extramarital affairs. She willingly birthed bastards for her own pleasure, endangering her entire family in the process, and overall, she should have a better understanding of how this Game of Thrones is played. A point that is often shown to us in Season 1 is that her father, King Viserys, was often seen as unfit to be king, because he was a good man. He avoided conflict, which made people see him as weak, and him being too morally good led him to be very indecisive. Rhaenyra knew that, and yet, because of this new portrayal of the character, she sort of becomes the same. All sort of agency is ripped away from her because the writers seem to be really afraid of her doing anything that could be perceived as bad. We couldn't have her send Rhaenys to her death in Rook's Rest. No, she had to selflessly volunteer herself for the mission so that Rhaenys could then selflessly volunteer herself instead, because gods be damned if Rhaenyra makes a bad decision. She can't have the same ruthless and authoritarian energy she has in the book, where she says, "Tell my half-brother I will have my throne or I will have his head," showing she's ready to lead with fire to end the pretenders to the throne. No, instead she sneaks into King's Landing like it's Mission Impossible to secretly meet with Alicent and say, "Let us do the peace thing, we can avoid more bloodshed, let's be pure about this, let's not be like the dudes." Even in her final confrontation with Alicent in the finale, she tells her she has to kill Aegon to take the throne, and she says it with such grief.
If I am to take the throne, I must put an end to the opposition. I must take Aegon's head. And I have to do it for all to see. You know this.
It's not because she wants it. She doesn't want it. It's because she has to. Her hands are tied. She's burdened with this foregone conclusion. She has to have his head. Ugh, what a pain. And her indecisiveness kind of impacts her authority, because as queen, she doesn't really do anything this season. People will say, "But Dylan, she's like focusing on raising an army." But is she though? She didn't send Daemon to Harrenhal. He just fucking flew there. She didn't send Jace to the Greyjoys. He just did that. The biggest moves the Blacks accomplished this season were mostly done by other people without Rhaenyra's command. It wasn't her idea to send food and gifts to the people of King's Landing. It was Miss Arya's. It takes her all season to secure more dragon riders, and it wasn't even her idea either. Jace suggested it. I'm not saying Rhaenyra has to be evil, but she is a queen at war. I don't think it works for her to be portrayed as never doing anything that could be even remotely unethical. She's gonna have to make some tough calls. She can't be a saint. And that's good, because we've been shown throughout her entire life that Rhaenyra has never been a saint. And that didn't stop audiences from rooting for her, and also understanding that most of her problems would have been solved if she had been a man. The problem with this portrayal is that as a result of the show stripping Rhaenyra from her moral complexity, it becomes very clear that the writers don't really know what to do with her this season. And yes, it is partially the point of her arc. Rhaenyra is essentially stuck in her castle and cannot take action in person in this conflict. She's frustrated that, as the queen, she has to be protected, meaning she cannot be an active player in this war. She's annoyed that she doesn't have much of a voice in her own council, who constantly undermine her, and she wants to impose herself because her authority needs to be recognized and respected, and for some people, feared. It's sort of her entire emotional arc this season. She feels stuck and uncertain about how to get to the next point, but the issue is, by the end of the season, this hasn't really changed. It's not like it's leading her to finally taking action. She ends the season just as stuck as she started it. She has her army, and she has her dragons, and she can gun for King's Landing, but she still doesn't have any agency. She's done nothing to assert her authority over her council or gain their respect. She has not taken action at all, and I think this failure to give her a concluded arc heavily contributes to explaining why this season feels so incomplete. I really think House of the Dragon Season 2 does not do Rhaenyra justice as a character, and if it wasn't for Emma Darcy being a fucking legend in this role, I don't know if I would still be that attached to her, because arguably to agree with a lot of the people's criticism, this season does make it very difficult to be invested in her story. And I'm of two minds about this. Either the show is too freaked out to explore the oscillating morality of Rhaenyra by fear of the audience perceiving it as a Daenerys Mad Queen 2.0, because we all know how that turned out, or they're going somewhere with this, and it's a little uncoordinated, and I guess we just have to let them cook. I don't know, can't tell, but if their long-term plan is to keep Rhaenyra shielded from any wrongdoing and to only portray her as this fundamentally good, just, authentic figure of female empowerment for this women good, men bad narrative, I think the point of her character is lost. It's dishonest, it's disingenuous, it contradicts how her story started and takes away all of her agency in this Targaryen civil war. Let female characters be complex. It's not a crime for them to be flawed. Two things can be true at the same time. Alright, let's talk about her girlfriend now. Look, I love Alicent Hightower. I think she's a fascinating character. In season 1, I was actually really captivated by her. From what I understand, a lot of people are of the opinion that Alicent Hightower's arc has hit a dead end this season. And I understand why people think that, but unlike Rhaenyra, where I sort of echoed that sentiment, I am more inclined to disagree with the consensus on Alicent. Because the thing is, on paper, in theory, Alicent is probably the most complex character in the entire show. But in execution this season? Nah. It's gotten so surface level that it feels like her character is being kept at arm's length by the writers. And yes, this goes back to the same issue I had with Rhaenyra. Even Alicent, despite the character being built on her morally gray conventionalities, something that very much defines her current position in the realm, the show now tries very hard to paint her more as a victim of the men around her. And there is little to no accountability in her arc. Again, she is weirdly presented as being this sort of martyr with no agency. But that's not to say I didn't like aspects of it. This season, we mainly watch Alicent as she slowly loses control over literally everything. We slowly witness her becoming completely powerless as every bit of authority or influence she had over the council or over her own children dissipates bit by bit until she essentially becomes prisoner of her own kingdom. This loss of control leads her to realize how little power she actually has, and watching her sons turn into the power-hungry monsters they are horrifies her. She has lost her voice in the council, and she has lost her authority over her boys who are now way too powerful at way too young of an age. So she leaves to have a day of peace and quiet outside of King's Landing. She floats in the water, looking at the sky, unable to reconcile that her life as she knows it has essentially ended. Everything she did, all the sacrifices, all her commitment to duty, all of it has amounted to this, an endless wasteland of tragedy and loss. The writer said in the behind the scenes of this episode that in this specific moment, Alicent contemplates suicide, which makes total sense for her character. Like I said, Alicent is all about honor and duty. Her actions have always been dictated by her devotion to serve or by her religious beliefs, but it backfired significantly. Basically, Alicent realizes that everything she believed gave her life meaning was meaningless. It meant nothing. It was all for nothing. There is no greater purpose. There is no right way. She's faced with the reality that in the end, it really is just about people bickering over a throne. She finally sees how absurd this all really is. From her perspective, she did everything right. She did everything that was ever asked of her. She followed every rule, made every necessary sacrifice, only to get to nothing. Everything she has ever believed in is void. It's empty. It means nada. That destroys a person. This is essentially the death of the fundamental pillars, the very foundation of her entire identity. And once she realizes all of it is meaningless, Alicent zooms out on her life and realizes how much she hates it. She hates this kingdom. She hates this status. She doesn't even like her kids. We've always seen Alicent being incredibly distant emotionally with her children. She doesn't know how to be there for them in that way. We get many scenes where she literally walks away from her kids when they're in emotional distress because she just doesn't know how to deal with that. She doesn't like her sons. She kind of likes her daughter, even if she ignores her most of the time. But she does sort of blame herself for how they turned out. The guilt is very present. There's a scene where her brother lets her know that her youngest son that lives in Old Town, away from this castle, is a good man. He's kind.
That's good. Kindness is a quality I found lacking in his brothers.
Yes, it seems the Red Keep, for all its privileges, may in fact be a less than salubrious environment for the forming of young men.
Was it the court? Was it their mother?
Alicent realizes the only son she has who is a good person is the only son she didn't raise, and the only one who grew up away from the weight of power. How do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile that everything you've lived for turned out to be pointless? This realization mirrors the conversation she had with Rhaenys in Season 1, when Rhaenys told her that unlocking the full power of the throne is not going to be what she thinks it is.
And yet you toil still in service to men. Your father, your husband, your son. You desire not to be free, but to make a window in the wall of your prison.
And the parallel is very clear, because Alicent describes leaving Westeros as being free. So she decides to make a final play so she can get that freedom. And boy, people didn't like that one. A lot of people were surprised and offended that Alicent agreed to let Rhaenyra kill her son in the finale. But really, if you take a larger look at the character, I don't get why people were so surprised by this. In case you didn't see that somehow, one of the biggest things about Alicent Hightower is that she's a fucking hypocrite. She never really had any integrity, and her grand sense of righteousness was always insincere. She judged and chastised Rhaenyra for having bastards and for having sex outside of her marriage, yet this season she's secretly having an affair with Sir Criston Cole, who is a knight. A knight she very much is not married to. We also know she aborted his child. She demands justice for her son's eye when Rhaenyra's son cuts it out. She tries to attack the child herself. Yet when Aemon almost kills his brother, the king, intentionally, which she knows in her gut is what happened in the battle against Rhaenys, she does not lift a finger. She also doesn't lift a finger when she finds out her other son raped a maid, and then she backstabs everyone to get that same son on the throne. She criticized the Targaryens for having what she considers to be queer customs, and yet she made her son and her daughter marry each other. She resents Rhaenyra for not being honest with her about having affairs with Cole and Daemon, and yet at the same time, she was being dishonest with Rhaenyra by hiding that she was courting her father to become queen behind everyone's back. Remember, Alicent and Otto had been planning to take the throne from Rhaenyra for like 16 years. Their plan was always to usurp the throne. Sure, it was Otto's plan and his ambition. Alicent only went along with it as a young woman, but she did know this was the endgame and followed through with it as an adult. Her sense of duty, of honor, and righteousness was always fractured because it was built on the end goal of committing treason when the time came. She might have felt conflicted about it at times, but she still knew what was going on. Alicent is a massive hypocrite. She always has been. It's a big trait of her character. She's always been willing to compromise her morals for a larger goal, no matter how morally backwards that goal is. So her agreeing to Rhaenyra killing Aegon to take back King's Landing so she can be free of it all and fuck off with her daughter without ever having to look back is not as far-fetched as some people try to make it sound. It's not that out of character for her. She's always made extremely unethical sacrifices to reach her goals. That's what Otto raised her to do, and that is what we have watched her do this entire series. She looks down on people with this misguided moral superiority complex, while it's also very apparent that she is just as immoral as the people she criticizes. And again, she's not stupid. She knows Aegon has to die. She knows the implication. She put him on the throne. She's the one who sentenced him to death. That's her fault. And look at where she ends up this season. Her goal is to abandon everything. Everything. The kingdom, the politics, her children, her grandchildren, everything. She's gonna grab Elena, maybe one of the babies, and that's it. Everything else she's leaving behind. Aegon can die. She doesn't plan to ever see him again anyway. He's a cripple now, and she doesn't think he's gonna survive and be much, so, you know, Rhaenyra might as well finish him off. She fucked over the entire kingdom to put Aegon on the throne. It turned out to be a disaster. She realized she had no real power or influence, and so now she wants to cut her losses and run away. Why are people so shocked that she's okay to pay for her freedom with Aegon's life? From everything we've seen, this is absolutely something Alicent would do. She's not above that, and she never was. And of course she's not going to acknowledge her involvement in her children's fate, because she's a hypocrite. You can sympathize with the sorrow of realizing that everything she's ever believed in was for nothing. It's a very human arc for any character, and it works really well for Alicent. But again, two things can be true at the same time. You can acknowledge that she wasted her life to serve the various ambitions of the men around her. You can feel for her as you watch her world crumble when she realizes she misunderstood Viserys' last words and Aegon was never supposed to be king. You can sympathize with all of it, but also still remember that Alicent is a horrible person and that she has always been morally compromised, despite the show trying so hard to depict her as a martyr this season. She is a victim in a lot of ways, but make no fucking mistake, Alicent's hands are not clean. Do not forget the fact that a lot of what happens to her and her children this season is about her losing control over a monster she helped design. She is just as responsible for this war as any other member of the family.
She blames me for starting this war, after she plotted with my father's council to usurp his throne. Her grace speaks with two tongues.
Personally, I really liked her arc this season. I still think this character is very, very, very interesting. It's not perfect, again, mostly because the show strips the female characters of their ethical complexity and agency, but I think the underlying progression of her character is really, really compelling. I have no idea where they're gonna go with her from now on. From what I understand, this is mostly off-book and I only know little pieces of what happens next, but I still really like the concept of that arc. And also, let's be real, Olivia Cook did not miss a beat with her performance this season. She killed that. She is so fucking good in this role, it's crazy. So yeah, that's our two main characters and their weird portrayal this season. A lot of other characters have parts to play in this season, some in better ways than others. I got a little tired of Corlys and his bastards. His sequences with Adam of Hull got quite repetitive, which is made even more noticeable by the fact that all of their scenes are on the same set, standing in the same spots, so at times it feels like you're just watching the same sequence over and over again. I did really like Adam though, and Alan, especially Alan. I liked him, and I like where his story goes. I think he's cool, and I'm curious to see where he's gonna go next. I couldn't shake the fact that he looks just like the guy from Milli Vanilli, but he seems like a character who's gonna have a lot to do in the future, and I'm kind of excited about that. Kristen Cole also has a compelling arc this season. He's such an easy character to hate, but you see a certain shift in him happening this time around. He's also kind of a hypocrite because he resents Rhaenyra for seducing him and ruining his honor, and yet here he is having a sexual affair with Alicent in secret years later. But after the Battle of Rook's Rest, something changes in him. Witnessing dragons fighting and seeing the sheer chaos and death they cause around their battles sort of horrifies him, and it makes Kristen feel incredibly small. This force zooming out makes him question what is the meaning of all this. He's a man who lived his entire life in the name of his honor, but after witnessing godlike beings battle it out in the sky, he suddenly feels so inconsequential that he begins to question if honor itself has a point. He has a fantastic monologue in the finale that is probably his best scene yet, where he sort of echoes Alicent's sentiment of having everything he's ever lived for amount to nothing.
Perhaps all men are corrupt, and true honor is a mist. You saw what I saw. The dragons dance, and men are like dust under their feet.
That also makes me very excited to see where his story will go next. Rhaenys is a character I absolutely adore. Losing her really hurt, but you gotta give it to the gal. She went out like a G. Watching her in this battle consistently make the choice to keep fighting when she's clearly outmatched and when she had several opportunities to flee to safety was just so powerful. And I think it's one of the scenes that had the best depictions of the bond between a dragon rider and their dragon.
They are a protector. Ordained to lead the Seven Kingdoms, to strengthen them.
The way she keeps telling Meleys to attack again and again, and then for their final attempt, it's Meleys that looks back at her as if she's saying, "One last fight, old friend." Man, this shit was something else. Episode 4 really is Rhaenys' episode, and it was incredible. I'm gonna miss this character so fucking much. Admiral Lohar is a character I find very intriguing, and I'm curious to see more of her, especially because I fucking love Abigail Thorne, and it's really nice to see that YouTubers can now cross over into such large projects. It fills my heart with joy. She absolutely deserves it. She is such a talent. But we do see very little of Admiral Lohar, and introducing her in an already bloated and anticlimactic finale might not have been the best choice. Again, the finale really feels like an episode should have followed, so it's hard to say, but I am pumped to see more of the character. I also really like Hugh, the world's most obvious main character. His arc with his wife and their daughter is a little long-winded but sweet. We rarely get to see the difficult life of the common folk, so it was somewhat interesting to see. Hugh eventually reveals that he is a secret Targaryen, which surprised literally nobody, and eventually he answers Rhaenyra's call to claim a dragon, and he becomes the rider of the second biggest dragon in the world, Vermithor. And by the way, Vermithor has to be the hardest name for a dragon ever. If I have to meet any animal that is named Vermithor, I will shit my pants before I even lay eyes on it. This name has no business being as badass as it is. I might call my child Vermithor just for the vibes. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room. I think when it comes to the general consensus around this season of the show, it's very clear that the storyline that has garnered the largest amount of frustration is Daemon's. Daemon spends the season in Harrenhal, where he supposedly goes to take the castle and raise an army for Rhaenyra, but his real intentions are foggy. He intends to stay there for a while, but Harrenhal is believed to be cursed, and quickly, Daemon becomes subject to strange visions that scare him, and he's then introduced to a new character who seems to know he's being haunted. I really like Alice Rivers. I think she's fun. I like how she brings back this sense of mystical intrigue to the show. The magic in Westeros has always been kept very mysterious on purpose because it's something that is beyond the comprehension of most people, and I did enjoy seeing more of that because while we got our fair share of magic in Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon doesn't really have magical elements as a big part of its story. And here's the thing. I don't think Daemon's arc is inherently bad. The concept of the arc and why it's there is actually pretty interesting. The problem is that it takes for fucking ever to get to the fucking point. Episode after episode, watching Daemon be in this sort of limbo dimension where we have to go through these insanely repetitive dream and hallucination sequences. It got so tedious. I think the season tries really hard to keep you on your toes about where Daemon stands with his allegiance. Is he gonna bend the knee to Rhaenyra, or is he gonna gun for the throne on his own? But I think from the moment he has a vision of young Rhaenyra, it becomes pretty clear where this story is going. But the thing is, while I found the arc kind of bland and repetitive and boring, I do really like where it ended. People are very divided about the final vision, where he sees the prophecy. He sees the White Walkers and Daenerys and the Comet, and Daemon is a character who never believed in any of that stuff. He's sort of an atheist in a world where everyone is so religious and matrixed by the gods. He doesn't believe in any of this shit, nor does he care to understand it. Some people thought it was too fan-servicey to show Daenerys, but actually it kind of makes sense to me, because she's not just some, like, far-removed niece of a cousin of a nephew to Daemon. Nope, Daenerys is a direct descendant to Daemon and Rhaenyra. So Daemon sees her in his vision because she's his great-great-great-granddaughter, like 6 generations removed. And yes, before you start commenting, I am aware that Rhaenyra is also his niece, which means he is also Dany's great-great-great-great-great uncle, but you know what I mean. God, this family is so fucking confusing. And look, I get why they decided to play the arc out the way they did. I get why they wanted to take their time with it. Daemon is a fucking asshole. He's a bad person. He was a terrible brother to Viserys. He murdered his first wife. He's a negligent father. He's abusive to Rhaenyra, and he's actually considering taking the throne from her too. How the fuck do you take a character this ethically backwards and justify a newfound loyalty to, well, literally anyone? Because don't get me wrong, at the end of the day, Daemon was loyal to Viserys. They had a very toxic relationship, but when shit hit the fan, he had his back, consistently. But who the fuck else is he gonna be loyal to now that Viserys is dead? And most of all, why would he be loyal to anyone else, even if it's Rhaenyra? The show needed to address this, and so under that lens, I believe it. I believe that it would take something this drastic and monumental for someone as selfish and impulsive as Daemon to finally fall in line. I believe that it would take for him to have a divine intervention where the gods literally show him his wife on the throne for him to finally shut his fucking mouth and bend the knee to Rhaenyra. It is way too long. It really drags, and mostly in the second half, every time the show cut back to Harrenhal, I wanted to fucking die. But I let them cook, and I personally wasn't disappointed with where it went. I think the writers failed to find ways to make it more compelling and relied a little too heavily on having Millie Alcock and Paddy Considine cameos to try and bait the audience into being into it. However, it's not unimportant. It has a point that we'll be defining moving forward, but getting to that point was very clumsy and tedious and annoying. So again, I feel conflicted about it. Surprisingly, Aemond and Aegon became some of the most interesting characters this season. Every time their scenes came on, I was locked in. Aemond in particular really gets to shine here. We watch him as his power very, very intensely gets to his head, to a point that gets a little crazy. Because at the end of the day, Aemond really is just an overconfident teenager. He's only, 16 years old? And he is in way over his head. A lot of that confidence he shows is a facade. He really just is a boy who wants his mom to love him, and power has become a way for him to feel like he matters because he was bullied as a kid and he hasn't gotten over it. He has no limits to satisfy his desires. He Dracarys the shit out of his own brother during the Battle of Rook's Rest with the full intent of killing him. That was a coup. He tried to kill the king knowing that he is next in line for the throne if he dies. He wants that crown, and my god, he is not fit for it. Sure, he's better at it than Aegon, who is a completely clueless idiot, but he's still doing it for the wrong reasons. It's about his ego, about proving to all the people that bullied him and thought lesser of him that he is better than them. His pride is still hurt from when he was a kid. He desperately wants for his mother to love him, but she's too emotionally distant. Aemon needs to feel like a big dog. He needs to feel like the biggest monster in the realm, and that's how he does it. But the thing is, it's never gonna be enough. He's never gonna feel like he matters enough, like he proved himself enough. He rides Vhagar, the biggest dragon in the world, the most vicious creature ever known. And he is now the king of the Seven Kingdoms, while the brother he almost killed lies away between life and death. He's at the top of the game, but he needs more. That said, as the season goes, reality starts to set in. Aemond is at war, and this shit gets a little too real. We essentially watch as his facade slowly starts to crumble, and you see the terrified kid hiding behind it. After being directly confronted by Rhaenyra with 4 dragons, he gets scared and runs away. But his ego is so hurt that he got scared that he flies to another village and just burns it to the ground, killing men, women, and children, just to reassure himself that he is, in fact, a big dog. And I think there is nothing more clear about his mask slipping than his scene with Helaena in the finale, where she tells him head on that all of his efforts are futile because she knows how he dies. Now, Aemon doesn't pay much attention to his sister, but he does believe in her prophetic visions, and hearing her say she saw his end truly terrifies him.
You were swallowed up in the god's eye, and you were never seen again.
I could have you killed.
It wouldn't change anything.
Reality has officially set in for him. His overconfidence has officially left the chat. This is not a game anymore. As for Aegon, he's also a little shit. He's a king nobody respects, and he desperately wants to be taken seriously, but he's incredibly inexperienced and too stubborn to listen to his counsel. When his son and heir is murdered by Daemon's botched assassination attempt on Aemon, Aegon loses his shit and starts to make a lot of stupid decisions. Getting rid of Otto, killing innocent people in the streets, making Kristen fucking Cole his hand, a knight who has no political knowledge and no skill for diplomacy, and then he jumps into the Battle of Rook's Rest unannounced, simply out of impulse. He tries to 1v1 Rhaenys, one of the most experienced dragon riders in the world, immediately loses, and he gives Aemon the perfect opportunity to gun for the throne by killing him and by claiming he was killed by Rhaenys in the battle. Aegon's arc this season is Murphy's Law. Everything that could have gone wrong for him has gone wrong. And to top all of that, because he is such a dickhead, he finds himself alone after his near-death experience. His life is basically ruined and he has no one by his side. He's completely alone and he barely has the will to live. This season has a knack to remind you that Aemon and Aegon are just petulant children with too much power, which is easy to forget with their actors. If you don't know, in real life, Ewan Mitchell and Tom Glencarney, the guys who play Aemon and Aegon, are respectively 27 and 29 years old. Olivia Cooke plays their mother, and she's 30. They're the same age. Olivia Cooke has talked about having conflicted feelings about that, and the fact that she's playing a grandmother at 30. It's definitely a wild casting choice, but the show reminds you pretty often that Aemon and Aegon are just arrogant teenagers. So yeah, again, this season of Hot D is a mixed bag. I didn't quite love it, I didn't quite hate it. Yes, it's a significant downgrade from season 1, but there's still a lot to like about it. The overall trajectory of the story is still interesting, and I want to see where this conflict is gonna go. The issue is mostly with the pacing of the story being handled very poorly, which is something that absolutely needs to be fixed. In case you don't know, it was announced shortly after the season 2 finale aired that House of the Dragon will be ending with its 4th season, meaning there aren't a lot of episodes left in this story. We're gonna be in the endgame very quickly, so we gotta make sure we pace this shit well. There are some worrying aspects of the writing that I hope are not the beginning of a continued decline. I hope the writers remember not to strip away the characters' complexities for the sake of a message, and I hope we don't lose the plot here. I want to be optimistic and tell myself that hopefully House of the Dragon Season 2 was a bit of a sophomore slump that will get back on track in Season 3. I want to believe it was the show's bad day at the office. The backlash to the season got very loud, especially when it comes to its ending, so maybe the showrunners will hear it and be more careful in the future? I don't know, it's hard to tell, but I still like the season overall. It has glaring issues, but I don't think it is devoid of merit. The performances were great, the characters, for the most part, are still great, despite the pacing of their arcs being a little messy. A lot of plot points leave in a really interesting place, like Otto being held captive who knows where by who knows who. I don't know what the fuck that's about, but I'm excited to find out. We desperately need Otto back in this show. And while this season feels like overly extended setup, it does feel like we have reached the point where the payoff is unavoidable. They can't keep stalling. We're gonna have to get to the meat of the story very quickly. And yes, this season does feel like it was at least an episode too short. I will never understand their choice to end the season in such an unfulfilling way, but let this be a lesson for the future. House of the Dragon Season 2 is not bad. It's not terrible. It is certainly not worse than Game of Thrones Season 8. You guys need to stop being so fucking dramatic. I don't feel like I watched this season and thought, wow, everyone is stupid now and nobody makes any fucking sense. Sure, maybe we need to get the ladies back to being layered characters with flaws, but I think that's an easy fix if they're mindful. But all we can do now is wait and see for 2 years. Anyway, see you in 2026.
Red like Hitachi.